Okay, so my name is Sean
Yes.
Scott. By trade, I'm a fire restoration contractor. I've been in the industry about 43 years. And so, as a result of my experiences dealing with literally tens of thousands of individuals and families and businesses go through the recovery process, there probably isn't much I haven't seen, and especially in wildfire or structure fire type of scenarios. So, um, as I was saying, so my daily job is I see fires just about every day. And so something happened in San Diego County, which is where I'm from. We had a wildfire event in 2003 called the Cedar Fire, and that was a fire that was I think the largest in state history at that time, and we lost about 4,000 homes. And then right on the heels of that in 2007, we had the Witch Creek and Harris fires, which again wiped out about 1,500 to 2,000 homes and countless others that were partially damaged. Well, it happened that one of the homes that was burned to the ground in that fire was a dear friend of mine. His name was Dan Lamborn, and he asked me to come and help him through the process. So, I'm out there sifting in the ash to try to find his wife's wedding ring. And literally there was nothing left but the hulks of what used to be a dishwasher, a washer and dryer and a refrigerator. And so fast forward 18 months later, I helped him through the process. He gets a great outcome with his insurance, and he's rebuilt his home. And so I get a call, and he wants me to come in with my wife, and they're having a housewarming party. So as we're driving through the neighborhood, this is 18 months later, I noticed that theirs is the only house rebuilt after a year and a half. And so I asked him, I said, hey, Dan, what happened, to your neighbors? And he said, well, the neighbor on my left got into a fight with their insurance company, lost their home, and moved away. And to this day, it's a vacant lot. And he said, and the neighbor on my right committed suicide. And when I heard that story, and I'm standing in this beautiful, newly built home, and hearing that testimony, I thought to myself, if those people had had somebody like me in their life, or maybe a resource that would help them navigate this process, maybe their outcome would have been different. And that's what compelled me to write my first book, which is the Red Guide to Recovery Resource Handbook for Disaster Survivors. And so as a result, I wrote the book, I printed 12 copies, and I gave them to our local fire chiefs. And I said, hey guys, if I could find a funding source, would you give this away for free to people who've lost their home in a wildfire, or maybe just had a regular fire, like a kitchen fire or a garage fire? So a couple months later, they read it and they said, this is fantastic, we love it. And the Department of Homeland Security and the Red Cross funded it on behalf of all the residents of San Diego County. So I thought, I was done. I left my mark in my community. It's a great thing. Well, then the governor's office said we want it in all 58 counties. And then I got contacted by Colorado, Idaho, Washington. It just went nationwide. And now we're going into Canada. So this is a topic that is a universal need. If people don't prepare for recovery, they don't even know what recovery, how to even navigate it. And that's why I tell people, you're literally one signature away from evolving from a survivor into a victim. And this presentation basically is going to highlight some of the key points that's going to protect you from making uninformed decisions, protecting your health and safety, and just knowing like what's to come in the months ahead. So with that being said, Kimber, can you put the slide deck back up?
All right, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so we can go ahead and how would you like me to flag you when to know to click a slide? Do you want me just to put a thumbs up, or?
Generally, I'm pretty good at that, but you can just say next slide.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so topic is basically wildfire recovery, our next steps to rebuild your life. Next slide. Okay, so there's two types of people that emerge from disasters, typically survivors and victims, and a little knowledge can make all the difference. This is where people have to surround themselves. They have to have a community of people that they can trust. They can bounce things off of each other, because this is a totally foreign situation. You've probably never gone through a wildfire, probably never will again. And so this is a unique environment where you need support. You need family, friends, and people who understand this process to be able to make those good decisions. Next slide. Okay, so the first thing I'd like to just touch on is now I know that we're 6 weeks plus past the event. So some of this, may be a little expired, but I still want to touch on it in case it's of value to you or your neighbors. Next slide. So here we have, a typical situation. Here's a lady who has been let back into her home, and she's staying there looking at all the devastation. And you'll notice that a lot of the items that are metal have a pretty thick surface layer of rust. Now, if it had just rained on these items, you wouldn't typically get rust this quickly. And what that is just a sign that when you have a fire and certain things combust, like plastics, the moisture mixed in, the humidity of the air, as well as everything that's burning, creates hydrochloric and sulfuric acids as part of the combustion process. And that's why you're seeing so much rust on all these metal things. It's literally an acidic reaction to the smoke. Okay, next slide. Now here, if you look at the bottom of the slide, you'll notice there's some sharp nails sticking up. So when a house burns to the ground, the bottom plate of the wall typically is charred, but it does not vaporize. And so oftentimes there's a lot of nails sticking straight up. So this is one hazard where you don't want to be wearing flip-flops or tennis shoes walking around in the debris. Next slide. And here we have, a gal, obviously very distraught, and she's got it looks like a gun safe next to her, and she's in shorts and flip-flops. This is really, really dangerous, not just for your feet, but you don't want to get ash and soot all over your skin or in your eyes and your mouth and that kind of thing. And you can see from the background, the haze, this is not very far or long after the fire was extinguished. So you can rest assured that the particulate in the air is pretty heavy here. Next slide. Now here, which I don't know if you can see this clearly on your end, but here's a fella who, his hands are covered in ash and he's wearing socks. He doesn't even have shoes on. So again, this is just to underscore, be mindful that there's a lot of hazards walking around, working around these environments, sharp metal, nails, your skin can absorb, the ash and some of the toxins that are in the soot. So wearing proper protective equipment is crucial. Next slide. This is just sort of one example of someone who stepped on a nail that wasn't wearing, proper footwear. Next slide. You don't want that to happen to you because you have to get tetanus shot and go through a whole thing. So be sure to wear proper PPE. So here's an image of a guy wearing personal protective equipment. He's got a hard hat. He's got a respirator, full face with P100 or N95 respirator cartridges, filters, Tyvek suit, rubber gloves, boots. So this is what that whole getup would look like if you're working around a home that's been burned to the ground. Next slide. Okay, so what's wrong with these pictures? So here we have, if you look closely to the left of the lady standing in the middle, there's active flame burning behind her. So obviously this lady was allowed into this neighborhood by, officials, or somehow she got in here. And this scene isn't even completely safe. It's not even, the fire's not even out yet. Sometimes these fires will rekindle, and when they think that it's out, and then hot spots will reignite and you'll get, this type of thing again. Next slide. But you notice she's wearing a bandana around her neck. Here's another one, little kids, playing it, or, looking at what was their bicycle. But look closely at the little boy's, shorts and his leg, hands, they've got soot all over them and ash. And parents don't seem to be too concerned. Next slide. Again, here's some older gentlemen, looking to salvage, belongings out of their home. These are very common images that you see whenever you Google wildfire aftermath. This is very, very common. The bulk of what you see with these images of people after wildfires is they're just wearing street clothes and not too much concern. Next slide. Here's an actual fire investigator. Again, no respirator, no gloves. Behind him is what used to be a flat screen TV. To his left was a sofa. So there's no question that he's breathing heavy concentrations of VOCs and odors from the smoke. But again, these types of images leave an impression and send a signal that this is not a big deal. This is an environment that's not to be really that concerned about. Next slide. And here's a gal who was told probably by her insurance company to go in and take photos of all her stuff. And again, her legs are covered in ash and soot, her hands, she's even got it around her nose, but again, people, this is not a topic people really are told, that these environments require us to, wear special respirators or take any type of special precautions. So next slide. So now I want to touch you a little bit about some of the questions were in regards to, the toxicity of combustion byproducts, soot, char, and ash. Now we're going to dive into this a little bit. Next slide. So now here's a similar picture of the people that we saw before that were wearing nothing. Now, obviously, these people were probably the owners of this home. Now, what do they know? Why is it that they're wearing like full hazmat gear versus the previous images? Next slide. Now, here's some contractors that were called out by the county to do disaster or site risk assessment or assessment of damage. And so here these guys, and they're wearing hard hats, full gear, respirators, big difference from the folks who are just the simple homeowners that were doing this same type of thing. Next slide. Yeah, again, county or city workers, or contractors hired by them, they're coming out looking for household chemicals, possibly like pesticides, herbicides, bleach, paints, batteries from cars. Also, there's all sorts of household items that you can't even throw away in the normal landfill. And so these guys, I'm sure, are out looking for things like acetylene bottles, propane bottles. But again, look at the level of personal protective equipment they're wearing, and chances are they're not going to be in this particular place very long, as they're looking for quickly, easily visible items that are known as hazmat. Next slide. Once again, they're doing air samples with their gear and their equipment, and again, this is nothing you're going to see that the typical homeowner would even think about wearing on a normal basis. Next slide. Okay, so going back into, so when was there really a correlation or a connection that soot, char, ash was really that big of a deal, or was a potential health risk? So in the 1775, there was a surgeon named Percival Pott, and he was the first person to discover a connection between exposure from chimney sweeps and a condition back then called soot wart, which is now known as squamous cell carcinoma. So what was happening is these chimney sweeps would take orphans, and because of their small size, they'd be like between 4 and 6 years old, and they would hoist them down these chimneys to sweep the chimneys, and the kids would come up covered in soot, char, and ash, and creosote, and all these things. Well, when the kids got to be around 10, 12, 13 years old, they were starting to develop these cancerous growths in their groin area, and they would die at very young ages. And it was at that point they realized that they were getting subjected to the poisons and toxins in the combustion byproducts that was being absorbed through their skin and getting in their eyes, and of course getting in their mouth. So that's when it was first discovered that there was a real problem with the toxicity of combustion byproducts. So next slide. So there's over 7 million mixture formulations that are found in homes and buildings across the United States, and most chemicals in commercial use haven't been tested. The toxins created in a structure fire are innumerable. And as an example, cigarette smoke alone has over 7,000 chemicals. So you can imagine when a sofa, or all the contents of a garage, a car, all these things, when they all burn and mix this into a giant toxic soup, you can imagine there's unlimited amounts of chemicals, byproducts, reactions, all sorts of things that mix together, creating other chemicals and gases. So yeah, it's pretty scary if you think about what all goes on in a wildfire event of a home. Next slide. So the question is, so how do toxins enter your body? So it's ingestion, obviously if you don't eat something, skin contact, so dermal absorption, and then inhalation. So if you put, for instance, if you've pulled a muscle in your back and you go to the doctor, sometimes they'll give you a patch, and that patch will go on your back, and within minutes, you'll start feeling relief because that medicine is absorbing through your skin, which is an organ, getting into your bloodstream and starting to address the the muscle ache or whatever the medicine is to do. So it just to show you that the dermal absorption is a powerful way of getting chemicals or medicines into your bloodstream. The same thing applies anytime you put anything on your skin. You've probably seen some of the YouTube videos of the police who have encountered unexpectedly fentanyl, where they touch it, and within seconds they're having seizures. So that's just a horrible example of how sensitive our skin can be. Now, children tend to be far more sensitive with skin contact than older adults. Their skin is thinner, it's softer, it's more permeable. So there's all sorts of things we'll talk about later on that. Next slide. Okay, so in this screen, you're seeing 4 different items. So the human hair is about 75 microns in size. If you ever look through a sunlit window when the sun's rising, and you'll notice you can see all the little things floating around in the air, those little dust particles, those are about 40 microns. Red blood cells, about 7 to 8, and E. coli bacteria is about 2 microns. The next slide. But in wildfire smoke, in many cases, the smoke particulate is less than 1 micron. And here we have electron microscope images of particles and with small little white spheres attached to them. So when you're in a fire environment, there's magnetism that takes place where certain particles will bond to other chemicals and other particles. So in some cases, you'll have a carbon particle that will be adhered to by maybe a dioxin crystal, or maybe a particle from a PCB or some other type of a toxic element that was, it could be a heavy metal like lead, arsenic, mercury, who knows. So anyway, when you breathe in something this small, it goes through your lungs into your bloodstream directly. And then that's why a lot of times after wildfires, it could be like in Northern California, there were thousands of people affected by the heavy smoke from the wildfires in San Francisco that ended up going to the hospital having chest pains, respiratory, ailments, and all sorts of things, because these toxins are getting through their lungs and in such high quantity that's overwhelming their immune system, and they start reacting. So yeah, so that's why there's a lot of county and city notifications about being very mindful of air quality. Next slide. Oops, I think we went too far. Yeah, one more back. Okay, yeah, okay, now next slide. There we go. Okay, so here we have a gentleman who was allowed into his home after a apartment fire, and you look on the floor, you'll see there's foam, which is used in this case to put out the fire. But here he is again, no shirt, no respiratory protection, no gloves, just looking for what happened to his home. So in this environment, after a fire, you're going to have dioxins, furans, sulfur dioxide, all these chemicals. And the last 2 I put is hydrogen cyanide and phosgene. Next slide. So one of the key byproducts of this is a wool sweater. When a wool sweater burns, one of the key byproducts of the combustion is hydrogen cyanide. And what's interesting is, next slide, is both hydrogen cyanide and phosgene were used in World War I as chemical warfare agents. So that just gives you another, indication that a wool sweater is, it's not a synthetic fabric, it's a natural fiber. You would never really think that would create something as toxic as hydrogen cyanide. So it's kind of crazy. Next slide. Then you don't hear too much about this chemical. This is actually a heavy metal, arsenic, but it is used and was used heavily prior to 2004. Next slide. In the manufacture of pressure-treated lumber. So they still use arsenic today in this process. It's a different chemical. It used to be chromated copper arsenate. Now it's called something else, but it still has a toxicity that's pretty dangerous. Matter of fact, if you go to a lumber store and ask them to cut a piece of this type of lumber for you, they usually, at least in California, they won't cut it. You can buy it and you have to cut it yourself, but the lumber yards won't cut it for you. Anyway, So when prior to 2004, this pressure treated lumber was impregnated with this arsenic, chromated copper arsenic. Is it chromated? Yeah. And so when it burns, it leaves behind, the arsenic in the ash. And so it's extremely toxic. And most homes, if not all, in the United States that are built today and even before, have this type of lumber that comes in contact with the concrete. So it's dry rot resistant, it's termite resistant, and it's used specifically as the bottom plate of walls or where joists lay on top of concrete stem walls and foundations. So anyway, this is very prevalent, and there's no question that this lumber was used in some of the homes that burned in the Marshall Fire. Next slide. So now we're going to talk a little bit about dioxin. Now, this is probably something that very few people have even heard of. I did a lot of research on this chemical, and it's far more of an issue than you think. So it's typically produced when wood, household, and petroleum products burn, such as PVC and different types of plastics. To give you an example, irrigation pipe is made of PVC. Some of your mini blinds, albums like LPs for music, were created out of vinyl. There's all sorts of products that have vinyl. Some not milk cartons, but drink cartons. There's a lot of types of plastic storage bins that were made with PVC. So anyway, there's a whole host of items that are in common household materials that have PVC that when it burns, it creates this chemical dioxin as one of the byproducts. Next slide. So how toxic are dioxins? So they're over 170,000 times more toxic than cyanide, 500,000 times more toxic than arsenic, second only to radioactive waste. They can remain in your body up to 12 years. They alter the genetic structure of living cells. It's a key ingredient in Agent Orange. They cause cancer and birth defects, and they enhance the activity of other carcinogens. There's no acceptable level of exposure per OSHA, EPA, and some of the other federal health and safety guidelines. So this is a really nasty chemical. If you go on Google and just type in the words toxicity of dioxins, especially one called TCDD, you'll find more information than you can imagine. I actually wrote an article about this. My article is entitled Dioxins, the most hazardous substance in structure fire environments. So you can look it up, and I go into the down the rabbit hole, into the weeds on this one. Next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit about your clothing and other textiles, smoke damaged textiles. Next slide. So in the insurance restoration world, typically, if you had clothing that was, say, contaminated with asbestos fibers or lead or mold or blood, sewage, there would be very little argument that those clothes would be a total loss, and the insurance company would, basically have you inventory them, provide them with the value of the garment, and pay you. Next slide. However, in our restoration world today, somehow textiles contaminated with some of the most toxic, combustion byproducts, including heavy metals, dioxin, can somehow end up in the dry cleaner or with companies that say that they can restore and clean them perfectly. And so that's interesting. Next slide. So I was actually at a fire, and this was a few years ago, and you'll notice in front here of your screen, there's a pile of children's clothing, and there's a small little red one kind of in the pile on the top. And I took about 5 or 6 pieces of clothing from this pile and took them to a restoration company to have them cleaned and deodorized. Next slide. So this is what the baby onesie looked like. So it had visible smoke damage all over it, and it was probably the most pungent smoke smell that I've smelled in a long time. I don't know, this fabric all the clothes, this entire house was extremely pungent. It must have been a lot of plastics must have burned in this one, and carpet. So next slide. So I sent it to this company, and they assured me that they could clean it, restore it, and make it safe. And it came back about a week later looking like this. Now, It smelled like Downy or Tide or one of these, commercial uh, laundry detergents, and it looked pristine. There was no sign of any smoke damage or any smell for sure. I mean, it looked great. So next slide. So I was just suspicious, and I thought, I'm going to send it to a lab. I sent it to a forensic lab on the East Coast, and I had it analyzed just to see if it truly was free of, and it truly was clean. And what came back was 44 of these chemicals that you're seeing here, and 4 heavy metals, including arsenic, chromium 52, cobalt 59, and lead. So that led me to believe that what was happening was that the processes being used to clean these baby clothes it didn't work. And yet this is what we're being told every day, that this process that these companies are using actually cleans your clothes. So True Clean doesn't smell like bubblegum, cherries, Downy, or Tide. True Clean has no odor at all. And so these fragrances are doing little more than camouflaging what's underneath. And I still have that same baby onesie in a Ziploc bag. And here it's been a year or two later, or 3 years later, and I open that bag and it smells like some kind of like metallic, crazy, I don't know what it is, but yeah, it's definitely, the fragrance wore off, and it's pretty bad. Next slide. So I'm talking a little about soot, char, and ash. So many of you who have not lost your home, but have had an intrusion of soot, char, and ash from the wildfire blowing in your home, we've got concerns about how to clean it, what you need to do, what you shouldn't do. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Next slide. Okay, so your home is not airtight. Okay, a submarine is obviously airtight, but your home isn't. There's all sorts of holes and ways that contaminants from the outside can get into your home. So I'm going to just show you a few examples. Next slide. So, okay, so top left-hand corner, this is a vent from an exhaust fan from a bathroom. So obviously you can see that wildfire smoke traveling at 100 miles an hour plus could easily drive soot and smoke right through that roof vent into your home. Then if you have a raised foundation, the slide or the image to the right of that, you can see this is a crawl space full of ash, dirt, and dust, and everything else coming right through that screen. Then down below you have a hood from a stove or a range. And again, the next slide shows, or the next image shows the actual outlet at the exterior wall. So that's where smoke and soot and ash can come right in your house, right through into your kitchen. And then the one on the far right is your dryer vent. So your dryer has an exhaust vent on the outside. And again, some of them are just a simple screening of 1/4-inch little squares of galvanized mesh, which can allow ash and debris and all sorts of stuff from the wildfire to go right into your dryer or into your laundry room. Next slide. And then you have recessed can lights. So recessed can lights are basically a 4 or 6-inch hole in the drywall of your ceiling. Next slide. And you can see in this image, when you pull the little trim off, there's gaps and there's holes in the actual can that, smoke odor and ash can filter in and get into the actual fixture and around into your home that way. Next slide. So here's some of the processes in the actual restoration process of like doing smoke remediation or fire restoration. Next slide. So step one, this is what I usually tell people is, every fire has its own DNA. So every fire, there's something different that is burned, composition of the materials, heat, time of burn, there's all sorts of variables. So what I typically do is advocate for testing for fire VOCs, particulate, just like you would in a asbestos, lead, or mold type of a job. So if you had a mold contamination in your home, you'd call an industrial hygienist. They'd come out, they'd take samples, and they would tell you what the spore count is of the mold in your home, what types of mold you have, and a protocol on how to properly remediate the mold from your home. Same thing would happen if they were testing for asbestos or lead. So this is a concept where if you have soot, char, ash in your home, in windowsills or in your carpet or whatever, I would personally get samples taken, have it tested, not to find out whether or not you have soot, char, ash in your home. That's obvious. But what is the composition of that soot, char, ash? Is it just burnt vegetation and wood and paper? Or is it something more sinister, like, lead, or, is there particles of lead or dioxins or arsenic or some of these other nasty characters that are from, a house burning next door? Next slide. So step 2 is removing all the sources of odor and burn materials. Now, obviously, if your house just has soot, char, ash, and it's not at this level of damage, that means you're going to remove like the insulation in your attic if it has ash all throughout it. You're going to remove, like draperies that are next to a window where there's tons of ash or soot all over these windowsills. Typically, what happens when textiles are exposed to heavy concentrations of soot, char, and ash and smoke is they get saturated to the point where the particles get embedded in the fabric. Very, very difficult to get those particles out. It applies to, carpeting, stuffed animals, clothing, anything pretty much that's considered soft goods, even some sofas. It's just the cleaning process, they just can't guarantee it. And so without knowing what the composition is of the soot, and just letting somebody come in and spray some Febreze on your textiles or sending them to the laundromat is no guarantee that it's going to come back what you think that it should be. Next slide. So then in, like say your attic space, if there is, a significant amount of smoke damage, this is significant, which is unusual. You probably don't have this level, but just showing you that wood is like a sponge. If you put, got an image of wood under an electron microscope, it would look just like a sponge. It's all sorts of little pores and, ducts for the sap and whatnot. And those things tend to, under heat, open and absorb odor. And then as it cools off, the pores tend to close and lock in and trap those odors. And then they only just reappear when it gets hot again. So a dry ice is often used to remove the surface layer of lumber that is typically what holds that smoke odor. So it's, if you're in a home that's got very minimal smoke intrusion, this step may not be necessary. So just wanted to show you this. Next slide. Okay, so then there's the HEPA vacuuming of any blasted material from the dry ice, or in your situation, if it's just soot, char, and ash that's on the floor, on the windowsills, they would typically go in and HEPA vacuum all surfaces. That means ceilings, walls, and floors. And you're probably wondering, why would they HEPA vacuum the ceiling? Well, in some cases, the smoke particles get magnetized, and they often will adsorb, which is ADSORB, adsorb, versus absorb onto surfaces. So absorption is where, like a sponge, it absorbs water. Adsorption is like a magnet that attracts iron filings. And so a lot of times, if you take a sponge, a chem sponge, or a white glove, and run your hand over a wall surface, you'll notice that there's, in some cases, there will be black or dark gray particle matter on your glove, and that's just evidence that the particles have adsorbed to the surfaces in your home. Next slide. So don't mask odors, because they'll be back. Just like Arnold would say, I'll be back. So yeah, when you take some companies use what's called a thermal fogger, which is basically taking a liquid and turning it into a gas, and it smells like bubble gums or cherries. And oftentimes that is used just to mask, camouflage those smoke odors. But when that camouflage dissipates, and when that fragrance is no longer holding on to the surfaces, if there is smoke trapped underneath, it will come through and you'll smell it again. So yeah, you want to make sure you don't just come in with a fancy smelling fog and think that's the end of the day. Next slide. So these are air scrubbers. So these are basically giant filters with HEPA filters in them. Sometimes people use these in conjunction with activated carbon filters. which is a great way to take care of VOCs as well as particles. This particular setup is primarily just for particulates. It doesn't really do much for gases. There's other steps for that. Next slide. Some people will, contractors will bring in hydroxyl generators or ozone. These are known to oxidize and eliminate a certain spectrum of odors and VOCs. However, with ozone, it creates a known host of toxic byproducts, including formaldehyde and other types of chemicals that are used in pesticides, or what do you call it, fumigation. I think it's bromethane is I think is the name of one of the chemicals. So ozone is a risky chemical or gas to use, especially in an indoor environment. If it's not carefully monitored and afterwards that the air is thoroughly purified in the sense that all the openings is evacuated, all the residual ozone that was used, this can make bad things worse. So it also creates hydrogen peroxide, which can bleach and cause colors to run in tapestries, oriental rugs, or colorful clothing. So be careful with ozone. I have written a whole paper about ozone. It's on my website if you guys are interested in learning more about the use of ozone, risks and rewards. Next slide. So then the step 7 is to encapsulate. So once you've done your surface cleaning and source removal, then you basically use a sealer to lock in anything that may have been missed through the HEPA vacuuming, the dry ice blasting, and the cleaning process. It's always good to use a good encapsulant just to catch anything that may have been missed, because it's inevitable, especially in an attic space, that there's going to be areas, nooks and crannies that you're just not going to be able to get to with a HEPA vacuum. And so going in and using an encapsulant is a great way to ensure that you're not going to get that odor reemergence. Next slide. And then the only way you're really going to know if your house is truly clean is to do a clearance test. Now, in the mold remediation world, after a mold remediation is done, a lab will come back out to verify that the mold remediation was done properly, and they'll do a clearance test. They'll take either tape samples or take air samples to see how many spores are left within the containment, and if the outdoor air is at a higher level of mold spores than the indoor, then you're clean. That's how they certify that you're in good shape, unless they find some nasty spore counts and you may have to re-clean. But in a wildfire situation, nobody ever says that they're going to do a clearance test. How do you know that all this vacuuming and wiping and filtering actually got everything out? It's your nose versus somebody else's nose. And so that's not a great way to sleep at night, knowing that you've protected your family's health and you've got an independent third party that's watching the store to verify that that was actually done properly. So step 8 is obviously a really great way to protect yourself, to know that everything was on the up and up. Next slide. Okay, now I want to shift gears a little bit and talk to you a little bit about pitfalls and predators. So many of you are now, well into your way of starting down the road to recovery, and especially for those who have lost their homes, burned to the ground, or know somebody who has, this information may be very helpful to you. Next slide. So part of this process is you got to start recognizing the wolves in sheep's clothing. Boulder is a semi-affluent area. Most people in the restoration industry know that there's big, fat, juicy insurance policies covering a lot of these homes. It's not like a low-income area that has limited coverage, where FEMA has to, kick in. So this is where you're going to have an influx of people that are looking to capitalize on the misfortunes of others. Next slide. So predators bank on survivors being uninformed and psychologically compromised. So in the days and weeks after a disaster is horrible as the Marshall Fire, most people are psychologically compromised to a certain degree where you're not really in a place to make heavy duty financial decisions and sign contracts, that have serious financial implications. So you need to take your time. You need to read every word of those contracts. And if you don't understand something, you need to get an attorney to review it and point out any things that might be a problem for you if there's a dispute. So the most vulnerable are typically the elderly, low-income families, people with language barriers, and those with cognitive or functional disabilities. Next slide. So the typical characters, everybody seems to want to help. First on scene, in the weeks thereafter are going to be your public adjusters, your contractors, content companies, which are those companies that handle nothing but personal property, your furnishings, your stuff. Then there's con artists posing as volunteers, relief workers, or clergy. And then there's the high pressure sales tactics, fear, greed, and freebies. So the fear is, hey, if you don't sign with us today, you may not get anybody to help you with your home for months. So, you better sign now, or we got to move on to the next one. Greed is where they say, we're going to give you $5,000 cash or a vacation to Hawaii. You just happen to be the winner of our drawing this month or this week. And we're going to send you to Hawaii. And if you sign, today, you instantly qualify, and we're going to give you the tickets. Freebies is where someone's going to give you like free services, a free estimate, or a free cleaning or whatever. And in turn, their goal may be to use this free offer as an incentive to get the total rebuilding of your home. So a classic example would be where somebody may come out and do some cleanup of the driveway, or get some debris and haul it off for you. And then they say they're going to do it for free because they care about the community. When in reality, they're angling for the rebuild of the home, which could be a $500,000-$600,000 job. So anytime somebody gives you something for free, it instills in you a feeling of obligation. This is a ploy to get you to give them a shot at that big golden goose, which is the rebuilding in this case. Next slide. So opportunists are waiting and watching. So there's all sorts of folks that are, scouring the internet and doing background checks on neighbors and on residents to find out all they can about you, to try to find common ground, to have a conversation with you, to, offer services, So next slide. So where do predators find their prey? Well, disaster shelters where the vulnerable congregate, town hall meetings and disaster assistance seminars, and they target the weak and convince them to trust. So the word con artist is a derivative from the word convince. So a con artist is someone who is a master at convincing people to trust them. So there's a lot of salespeople that are scouring these neighborhoods in Boulder that are absolutely expert at convincing, expert salespeople who have, highly trained, go to all sorts of trainings and schools to learn how to, understand human nature. There's all sorts of tactics that are used to put them a step above their competition, to be first in line to get, a shot at some of your insurance proceeds. And next slide. So here's, some of the areas where out-of-town salespeople will look to find, their potential clients. It'll be at your sports bars. It'll be at church. It's going to be on social media. It's going to be at the Residence Inn, where, people typically will stay who've been displaced, and everybody gets together at the bar and has drinks. Well, those salespeople are in there, right there amongst them. And then on the newspaper, there's all sorts of information about all sorts of, stories about people and their testimonies and their name and where they lived in the newspaper. Next slide. So disaster chasers, whether it's a hurricane, tornadoes, hailstorms, or wildfires, have the same access to the same information as bounty hunters, debt collection agencies, and private investigators. So one of the resources that they can use is a website called truthfinder.com. So you would be amazed if you put in your own name and your own address, how much information is on the web about you for a couple dollars. So this is the world we live in, and make no mistake that everybody knows everything about you and you know very little about them. So next slide. So why are there so many salespeople interested in you? Next slide. So to give an example, your insurance policy equals a huge payday. So I'm going to use an example as what a public adjuster has the potential to make. So they typically charge 10%. So let's say your house burns to the ground and you have $750,000 worth of coverage. Well, if they get 10% of that, they're getting 75 grand. If there's extended replacement cost of another 50%, they get another 37.5. Building code upgrades, 7,500. Detached structures, barns and fences, another 15. Debris removal, 7. Landscaping, 3,500. Personal property, they can make 45 grand. And additional living expenses, possibly 35,000. So if you add all that up, having a public adjuster on a claim, they can walk away with $225,500. That's an enormous amount of money when you consider how little work they really have to do to get a good settlement. Now, there are situations where a public adjuster is very helpful. So, but you need to calculate the risk and figure out if the risk is worth the investment. Because ultimately, if the insurance company pays you $750,000, you're going to have to find somebody who's going to do the rebuilding for that much less than what the actual value is of the reconstruction of your home. So that would mean you'd have to find somebody to do the work for $675,000. So anyway, next slide. So this is just actually a YouTube video. I'm not going to play it, but you can take a picture of this slide and watch this. This is actually a gal who's got some really good insight on tactics used by con artists. So you might want to just check it out at some point. And it's not very long, but it's just kind of raise awareness of what tactics can be used for disaster chasers. Next slide. Okay, so now talk a little bit about shady movers. So, when you're talking about a home that has smoke or soot damage, a lot of times what you're given is a work authorization where a company just doesn't give you a price, doesn't tell you how much anything's going to cost. They're just going to say, hey, we're going to take care of it, sign here, and we're going to bill your insurance company. So then they pull up and they take all your stuff and away they go. And then, 2, 3, 4 months later, there's a bill for $40,000, $50,000 for moving your stuff, 10 blocks away. And the challenge here is that if the insurance company balks at that bill, they don't necessarily have to pay just because they're charging $50,000. You're on the hook to pay the balance. And if you don't pay it, then they can hold your stuff hostage. Next slide. And it would end up something like here. I don't know if you've ever, I'm talking to you like I'm talking to one person, but it could end up in like storage wars if you ever watch it on TV, where people basically abandon a storage unit with their stuff, and then it goes up to auction for $1,000, and all your belongings are in there. So I would never allow some strangers into my home to take all of my stuff without doing a serious background check on the company, the employees. Do they drug test? Are they using temporary labor? I would also get a copy of their liability insurance policy to name you as an additionally insured. If that way, if stuff comes back broken or things are stolen, you have some recourse. So be very careful when it comes to letting strangers move your stuff, take your stuff away. Next slide. So before you select a contractor or a public adjuster, take a photo of their driver's license and license plate. Check court records, references, and do your own background check. You're about to get married, and you need to find out, is he or she really right for you? Because what you're about to sign is legally binding. So like I said before, get legal advice and change what doesn't work for you. So when someone gives you a contract, That doesn't mean you can't change some of the language, because these contracts were made by lawyers for restoration companies or public adjusters to benefit them, not you. So to level the playing field, you may need a lawyer to read it and insert some additional language or attach another document that will give you some rights in case of a dispute or a problem down the road. Remember, these people are perfect strangers in most cases. You have no idea who you're dealing with. And the salesperson who gets you to sign that authorization on day one, you'll probably never see again. You're going to be handed off to a project manager or a superintendent or somebody else. And now all of a sudden you realize that that really nice, good looking guy or gal that's, sold you is no longer in the picture, and it could be a completely different animal. You could even be subcontracted out to some other company and not even the same company that you thought you were getting. So next slide, please. So now we get to play a little bit of a game. So now this slide originally should not say busted, busted, busted on it, but this is the challenge of me not controlling my slides. But anyway, so all three of these people were convicted con artists. Obviously, the guy in the middle, Bernie Madoff, was a major con artist. But what I wanted to talk to you about real briefly is the contestant number one. She was a contractor guilty of 28 counts of defrauding wildfire victims. So I'm just going to read for a minute. This is an actual article written in the Santa Barbara Independent newspaper. So it says here, between April 2009 and May 2012, Penny Estes, and that's her name, scammed 10 Santa Barbara homeowners who lost their houses in the T and Justacita wildfires out of millions of dollars, promising to rebuild their homes, but spending much of their money on hotels, restaurants, shopping, and travel. She and her company, Green Building America, reportedly received $4.87 million from the contracts, which either went over budget, were never completed, or both. Estes was arrested and charged with 25 felony counts of grand theft, obtaining services by false pretenses, diversion of construction funds, and a slew of tax violations. Many of those charges carry special allegations that she preyed on senior citizens and victims of natural disasters. Most of the victims handed over all their insurance money, and many dipped into their savings. When things started to go sideways, homeowners hired lawyers but found little to no success. Next slide. Okay, Kay Hillary, 77, and Robert Hillary, 85, and these are the Hillarys in court, testified how Estes swindled them out of $536,000 that Estes used to set up her operation. Kay said that Estes preyed on her and her husband and even brought flowers to Robert in the hospital following his back surgery. Estes was sentenced to 11 years, 8 months in prison. So I'm going to ask you this. Do you think that these poor people will ever see a penny of that $536,000 again? Absolutely not. But it could have been avoided. They didn't have to give her all their insurance money to her, but they were conned. Next slide, please. So this is just giving you some examples. This is just a few hours after the tornado struck Moore, Oklahoma. These guys were busted, scouring the neighborhood looking for gun safes, jewelry boxes, and any valuables. Next slide. Here's a guy after Hurricane Sandy was going around to the different houses with, you can look and see he's got a blue bucket with some bolt cutters. He was salvaging all the copper pipes out of, water pipes out of people's homes. Next slide. Here's a clown that was a moving company that got busted at 18 different aliases, and he ripped off hundreds of families, taking all of their personal property that he said he was moving from their old home to a new home, and basically keeping the stuff and selling stuff on eBay and doing all sorts of, he was just a crook. Next slide. So here's what scam victims have in common. This is another one of those slides where you might want to take a picture or a screenshot of this. So most scam victims don't understand or recognize common persuasion tactics. They hush the logical voice of reason inside them. They rush into making important decisions. They are alone or isolated in some way. They are afraid of being rude or confrontational. They get emotional and succumb to fear or greed. And lastly, they fear retribution if they call the police or authorities. So these are what most, if not all, scam victims have in common, are these 7 points. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm not going to spend too much time here, but just want to touch on a couple things on the insurance claim process. Next slide. So when all is gone, when your house is completely destroyed, one of the things that your insurance companies ask you for is how to make an inventory of all your personal property. And this is a very, very difficult process, especially when you're emotionally and psychologically compromised, to remember every single thing you had in your home. I mean, trying to remember just what's in the top drawer of your nightstand is next to impossible. So this is a situation where you need tools. I created a tool called the Personal Property Memory Jogger, which is an example of a resource that you can use that has over 6,000 of the most commonly found items that would broken down into rooms. So without having a tool that will help you remember what you possibly had, you're going to potentially be leaving thousands and thousands of dollars of insurance money that would belong to you, but you just can't remember what you had. Next slide. Okay, so Kimber, is there a way that you can change the view option to be in the PowerPoint mode? Because for some reason it's not giving you like this. That price shouldn't pop up until I say hit slide again.
Yeah, no, it came across more like a PDF than a PowerPoint.
Ah, okay, gotcha. Okay, well, anyway, so this was another fun game that we'll can't really do. But so this is a drawer in my house. This was basically all the little kitchen utensils, and I took every item out of this drawer and priced it online on Amazon. And after about 2.5 hours, I came up with $844.70. So you can imagine, this is just one drawer, and all those little things are, add up to be a significant amount. Next slide. Now this next slide is really crazy. So this next slide is, just to set this straight, since this is being recorded, this is not in my house. Okay, my wife does not have all that stuff. And what's crazy is this is just for lips. So this drawer is a makeup drawer that just has lipstick, lip liner, lip gloss, lip pencils, all that stuff. So I had no idea how much was in here. So my wife was actually able to identify most of the items in this drawer, and it came up to, can you hit the next slide? Oh, okay, it didn't show it. Well, anyway, that makeup drawer had over $4,000 worth of cosmetics in that one drawer. It was just unbelievable. So unfortunately, I can't play the slide the way I wanted to. So, and then tackle box. Just remember, little items add up fast. So just because you have, what used to be your tackle box in your garage, and now it's just a blob of unrecognizable plastic, trying to remember how many little lures and different things you had in your tackle box could be, $1,500 to maybe $2,000, depending on how big the box was and what was in it. Next slide. Okay, so that is the end of my really kind of rushed presentation. For more information, that's my website and my phone number and my email. And now let's open it up for some Q&A. So you guys can share.
Yeah, so I thought what we could do is, because we had over 100 questions submitted from the community, I'm going to outline kind of the top buckets, and then thought we could start with that. Sean, would that work for you?
Sure.
Okay, great. So for those of you, these are kind of the buckets that the Q&As, that were the questions, I should say, that came in, fell into. So one, where there's a lot of questions of whether or not people need to go through smoke mitigation. And there's another one about what is and isn't salvageable, the order and sequence of remediation, which you talked through some tonight. There's an area about how do I know if my home is safe to return to? You touched upon that already. People wanting to know how to monitor the air quality in VOCs ongoing. Concern about recontamination as the debris removal process starts. The long-term health effects of these toxins, and just kind of longer-term risk exposure. over the next several years. So I just wanted to preview what the questions were for those of you on the call.
Yeah.
You know, when I'm on United Policyholders, I'm like, are you going to answer my question? So that's what we're going to start with. So Sean, the first one is, how do I determine whether or not I need smoke remediation? And just to give you some background, there's things around here about who do I trust? How do I know who I can trust? There's a lot of questions about, I am X number of feet or 0.2 miles from the fire. Does that tell me whether or not I need remediation? And then there's also, I don't smell smoke, but I saw some ash. Is it enough for me just to clean up that ash?
Right. Okay. So lots and lots of questions there. So for all of you who have attended this little webinar, you know, I'm going to try to make myself personally available as much as I can to answer any questions that we don't cover tonight via email, or you can, you know, give me a call. There's my office phone number and my email, and then I'll try to reply to you guys, you know, with my cell phone, and maybe just talk to you, you know, off and on throughout the next few days. There are a ton of resources on my website. If you go to the redguidetorecovery.com, there's a tab at the top that says free tools. Matter of fact, is it possible to pull up my website on this in the Zoom?
Is. Yep. Just let me finish moving the information into the chat box, and then I'll pull it up.
Okay. Yeah, so before I answer the questions, I want to point out a couple of things, because this may answer a lot of questions that people have that they can, you know, sort of get in-depth information more than what I can maybe share on a 10 or 15-minute call. Okay, so this is my homepage of my website. So if you click on free tools.
Let me just make sure it's sharing. There we go.
Okay, yep, there it is. I see it. Okay, so right there it says free tools, and if you click on that, there's all sorts of wildfire recovery resources, and scroll down a little bit. So all these things here, so if you look here, there's about 20 or 22 different articles, PDFs, Excel sheets, there's all sorts of stuff here. You'll notice there's a lost pet poster template. There's you know, stuff about risks and beware of using ozone. Yeah, Kimber, if you can just keep it up for right, you know, I need to be able to see. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so on the left-hand column, there's an article that we talked about, soot, char, and ash. It's more toxic than you think. So this is something that's been published in R&R Magazine, which is a trade magazine for restoration. Most of these articles have been published in other magazines, so you can find them other places than just here, but this is the full article. One article is called, "What do you mean you still smell smoke?" There's people, you know, that fail at the remediation process, and they will claim that you have a condition called phantosmia, which means that you're smelling phantom odors, and they'll say that they don't smell it. There must be something psychologically wrong with you because we've cleaned your house. I wrote a whole thing about that. The fact is I think it's a scientific fact, matter of fact, that women typically have a keener sense of smell than men. So in some cases, a guy may not smell what a woman is smelling, and she's not crazy. And then there's, you know, a whole article about dioxins, restoring smoke damaged textiles, addressing toxic smoke particulates. So I just want to encourage you. These are free tools. You use them, download them, share them, you know, give them to your neighbors who need this information, you know, post them on social media. I'm not getting anything from any of this. So this is just for you guys, for your information. Do with it what you want, but it's going to be really helpful to answer a lot of these questions that are, you know, kind of brewing in your minds tonight. So, okay. Anyway, so now let's move on to asking some questions. So, I forgot. What's that?
I think someone maybe forgot to put themselves on mute. So you can move forward with the first question.
Okay, what was the first question we were talking about was
how do I determine whether I need smoke remediation? And just a quick time check, we're at 7 o'clock, 10 minutes. I think people are willing to stay over, but I just kind of want to do a time check on that.
Okay, well, I'm good for a bit. So whoever wants, you know, to let me answer a couple of these initial like big questions, and if somebody else has something where they want to chime in, can we open it up so some people can chat, or is it just too many people?
If we could go through these, because this is over 100 questions represented, these buckets, and then maybe we can do the chat at the end. I want to make sure we hit like the biggest buckets first.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's start with what was the first one?
How do I determine whether or not I need smoke remediation?
Okay, got it. Well, that's very subjective. So being that you had winds over 100 miles an hour, you don't have to be very far away to get a lot of smoke and soot in your house. So the way to tell is, to do like the white glove test, or get something like one of these. This is what we call a chem sponge. It's just they sell them in restoration type supply houses. And you wipe the wall surfaces or your floor, and if it comes up with lots of soot, you've got ash and soot and char in your house. So doing it with the white glove or with this type of chem sponge is a great way to be able to tell if you've got any level of contaminants in your home. So that's one way.
I'm just going to dig in deeper based off of some of the questions. So is there like, okay, I had a little bit of ash on my windowsill, but I don't smell anything. If I just clean up that ash, is that good enough?
Okay, so there's a question that came up on the chem sponge. So a chem sponge will show, it picks up everything. So if it is wiped on a wall, it's going to, if it comes up tan, that's typically household dust, skin cells, dust mite, it's the normal stuff. If it's dark gray or black, that's typically going to be wildfire debris or soot, and ash, that kind of stuff. Okay, so this is basically the proper name. This is vulcanized rubber sponge, and it's the trade name. They call them chem sponges. And so they're very, very dense, and they're really good at picking up surface debris and soot and stuff. Okay, what was the second part?
So the second part is, some people are just saying, if I don't smell smoke, but I have a little bit of ash, is it enough that I just clean up that ash?
Well, the problem is as you're living in this environment for a certain period of time, you become desensitized to the smell. And so it isn't necessarily that it isn't there, but it may be at a point where you become numb to it. So that isn't necessarily true that the smoke smell isn't there. So the only way you're really going to tell is to do a VOC test. Have an industrial hygienist come out and take some air samples and have that sample sent to a lab and have it analyzed. And so that's one definitive way you can tell what's in your home.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question. There's a lot of questions about whether a specific item is salvageable or not. And I know you talked through the clothing example specifically. I'm not sure the best way to do this. I'm just going to run through the list. It could be like a speed round dating thing. And you're going to say if it's salvageable or not. So food, food salvageable.
Okay, wait. So food, again, depending on the level of contamination. So if you have like, a half inch of ash all over your house, it's all gone. Just forget it. If you have canned goods, typically the surfaces can be wiped down. But again, all of this is prefaced upon what is the composition of the ash. If the ash has lead, arsenic, mercury, other heavy metals, or other toxic substances in the ash, that changes the dynamic. Are you going to eat a box of cereal that was partially open after a fire that had possibly some, particulate in the box? No. So anything that was open I would say, should be discarded. If your refrigerator and freezer was without power for an extended amount of time, I would inventory all of the items in the refrigerator and make those, I would consider that stuff a total loss, because you just don't know what kind of spoilage. Now the freezer typically will last at least 24 hours or longer before you start having an issue there. But yeah, did I kind of address that? Was that good enough?
You did. I've got about 15 other items to go through with you. So
okay.
Dating, not long dating.
Mattresses. This is very unfamiliar. Usually, once I got in the room, I was done. It was just one. Let's go. One and done.
Okay, mattresses.
Yeah, mattresses again. It's super absorbent. If it's close to a window and there's soot and ash on the windowsill and you're close to the proximity of the fire, I would say it would probably be a goner, because it's
Okay.
next to impossible to get the odor, the particles out of the foam and within the bedding. Same thing with pillows, bedding in general, blankets, comforters, duvets, all that kind of stuff. I would say, if you're close to that, I would say it would probably be a total loss. And I don't think you're going to get much pushback on that. Children's clothes, again, this is that slippery slope where there's a lot of variables to determine what is salvageable and what isn't. And I can't necessarily say that every stitch of clothing within 10 miles of a wildfire has to be thrown away, but you have to use some common sense and realize that in the world we live in, if you went to Denver and walked around, for a couple of days just in the city, you're going to be breathing so much particulate and so much pollution and so much car exhaust and jet exhaust and stuff that's in the environment we live in. So there's a certain level of normal environment pollutants we live with every day. So what's the difference between that and a wildfire situation? Well, it's the concentration of these types of unusual heavy metals that would be far more in the particulate size, more of an exposure issue than you would in a normal city setting. So I don't know how to quantify and to say what should be thrown away and what shouldn't. It really is a case-by-case basis. It's always been. An indicator would be to take an article of clothing and have it sent to a lab. I use a lab in Michigan called Prism Analytical. They're the ones who tested the baby clothes. There's a Vista Labs in California. There's a couple of others. I don't come to the top of my head, but Prism Analytical is known to be one lab that can test textiles.
Okay, great. Some areas of debate with insurance companies that we've heard a lot about, carpet. So actual, not like a rug, but the carpet and the carpet padding installed in your home.
Well, for me, again, if it's got covered in soot, char, and ash, it's gone. I'm not even going to go there. It's, in my opinion, that stuff, without even knowing the concentrations or the composition of the ash, if it's close to all those homes that burned, I usually wouldn't take a chance.
Okay. Insulation is another big one that people are asking about. Should it all be replaced? And what about encapsulation?
Well, and typically attic insulation there's not much pushback about removing, replacing that, because you have so many vents that ventilate attic spaces where it allows ash directly to enter the attic. Usually there's this fine layer of ash in the attic spaces if you're close to the wildfire. So yes, you should replace the insulation, have your ducts cleaned, the filters changed in the furnace, have everything HEPA vacuumed, and probably encapsulate the exposed framing. The further away you get from the fire, the better it is for you. But I would go up in your attic space and look and see if you see ash, or if you smell heavy concentrations in the attic. Those are good places to start.
And just for those folks who have insurance companies that are saying they'll remove the top couple inches of insulation, would you say that is not sufficient?
No, you got to replace it all.
Okay. That's for those who are fighting with insurance. Okay.
Yeah. Now, some people, there's different types of insulation. You have blown in, which is just looks like snow, and then you have bat insulation, which is in those blankets, and so both of those it's like an odor sponge. It just holds the odor, so that typically insurance companies pay to replace that.
Okay. What about toiletries and medications?
Well, again, depends on where they were. They're inside of a cabinet, inside drawers. They could have been shielded from a lot of the contaminants. If medications were open, absolutely discard them and get new. Again, I'm sort of trying to give an opinion on such a broad question. It's very difficult to answer questions like this without seeing. It's a kind of a case-by-case basis. You got to use common sense. If you feel like there's a significant amount of soot, char, ash on your stuff, and like if you have a candle holder on a bathroom vanity and you lift that up and there's a ring that shows that there's ash all the way around it, chances are you've got a significant amount of wildfire contaminants in your home. And again, using the white glove test or using a chem sponge is going to really tell you a lot. Now, the other thing is if you really, really need verification for your peace of mind, just hire an industrial hygienist to do a soot, char, ash sampling. They'll tell you. So that's one way to get a professional in there to tell you that answer.
Okay. What about, there's questions about things that are behind cabinet doors or drawers, and you just touched upon that. Can smoke and ash not get in behind doors and into drawers?
Well, again, if the windows were open during the fire, we're going to have a different conversation versus if all the windows were closed and it was pretty sealed off. You're not going to have that level of concentration of smoke getting in to get behind in all those nooks and crannies. Now, remember the slides I was showing, you had recessed can lights, you had a dryer vent, you have other penetrations that allow soot and odor into your home, not just the windows and doors. So, and then we're tracking stuff in. When you come home, everything that's outside on the sidewalks and on the lawn, you're just bringing it inside. So you got to also be mindful that you're reintroducing all these contaminants, maybe even after your house is cleaned, and the insurance company is not going to want to pay to clean your house twice.
I'm actually hearing a lot in the community that insurance companies, rather than mitigate recontamination, are encouraging people to move back in and saying, if you discover ash again, then we will just re-clean your home. Which is
get that in writing.
Well, I mean, it's so disruptive though, right? Then you have to find housing and anyhow, okay. Kids' toys, like hard toys, not stuffies, you already touched on that, but hard Legos, cars. Would you say kid things should just...
I mean, I'm coming from a different perspective, meaning that I think that if, a child is under the age of 6 and has the propensity to put things in his or her mouth, I'd probably discard it and, get brand new Legos. I mean, it's just not worth it, especially if the room had a significant amount of ash on the windowsills or in the carpet. It's not worth the health and safety of your children to, save a couple $100 on toys.
Okay. There's so many more items, but I'm going to just ask one more because this is a common one I've seen as well, is things that are on the kitchen countertop, air fryers, toasters, coffee makers. If it's out on the counter, do you think that can be restored?
Yeah, a lot of stuff can be cleaned with, believe it or not, soap and water. A lot of these restoration companies don't use much more than, regular Dawn dish soap, to clean like utensils, and put them in their own commercial dishwasher. So some of that stuff is not that big of a deal to deal with. Somebody posted a question, where do you get chem sponges? There's a website, company that I buy all my equipment and chem sponges from. It's called Aramco. So I'm going to put the in the chat the name so that everybody can look it up. It's okay. So I think I sent it. Yeah.
Yep.
So that is one company. I'm not a salesman for Aramco. I'm not promoting them. I'm not getting any commission. I'm just saying that's where I bought stuff before. So just got to put that out there,
I'm going to move to the third category, order of remediation. So you walked through the process that you recommend. What we're learning in the community is because there are so many homes with smoke damage, there are not enough people to do the work. And so a lot of the remediation companies are saying, do the insulation at the end or in the middle, or it doesn't matter. And so there's a lot of question around how important is it to start with the insulation?
Well, remember the key to odor removal, getting rid of and deodorizing home is source removal. The source of the odor has to be removed. So if in this case it's insulation, that would be the first step, is get that insulation out, because that's going to have tons and tons of, contaminants that's going to keep reintroducing more and more odor. Now, the challenge here is, and this happened a lot in Sonoma County and some of the other Air Paradise fires, people had their homes thoroughly cleaned, and they were certain houses were surrounded by burnt houses, and where you'd have a neighborhood of like 20 houses and only 2 survived. In those cases, the odor the smoke got so strong that they literally had to tear the drywall off because it was in the wall insulation. And so in certain cases with 100-mile-an-hour plus winds, depending on how the house is constructed, it's possible that smoke odor can get trapped in the wall cavities. The only way you're going to know is to have a hygienist come out and do some, select sampling of some exterior walls to see if there's any issues. It has a lot to do with the type of finishes on the outside. Stucco breathes differently than siding, depending on the type of siding, certain type. So yeah, so that's something to think about, as far as concerns over that reoccurrence of smoke odor down the road. Because I'll tell you, when it gets humid and hot is the most likely when you're going to smell smoke. And that's not going to come around for 6 months.
Exactly. Back to the insulation piece of it. So a specific question is, aside from removing the smoke smell, there's concern about removing the insulation, re-stirring up the particulates, and recontaminating the house if it's not done at the very beginning. How would you?
Okay, so say that one more time.
Yeah, so I think beyond the smell of smoke that could be in the insulation, there's concern that, so let's say you clean my exterior, you're wiping down my walls, my stuff has been sent out to be cleaned, and then they suck out the insulation. And in that process, the concern is the sucking out of insulation is going to recontaminate what's been cleaned. And
well, so partially true. So you have workers that are, in some cases, they have to take down a portion of the ceiling in your house to be able to access, to get the old insulation out, and to have workers vacuum and seal and do all their processes. So you're going to have all this construction debris from drywall removal, guys going in and out of the house with bags and stuff from the attic to the front door to their truck. So yeah, I mean, that's a mess. So you definitely don't want to do that. You want to do that first.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, you could do it in a different, fashion if you had a different access point to get in the attic, but I'm just saying typically they would take that insulation out.
Okay. So the recommendation would be, if your remediation company is saying, we'll just fit you in later when we are able to get you in, is to say, my preference is to actually start with that because I don't want to recontaminate. Okay.
And the other thing is people should be getting a firm price in writing of what all of this is going to cost. Don't just sign a carte blanche work authorization to charge whatever you want because you don't care, because that is going to be the road to disaster. So if you were doing a remodel on your home, you would have your contractor give you a price for the plumbing, the electrical, the framing, all these things would be broken out. You would know what you're paying for. There'd be a price on the contract. Well, this is the same thing. Nobody should be just coming in saying, don't worry about it, we're just going to charge your insurance. There's no guarantee the insurance is going to pay. So get a firm price, get the insurance company to agree to that price, then move forward. Okay. Because if the insurance company doesn't agree to pay what your contractor wants, you either got to find another contractor who will do it for the insurance company's amount, or you got to get a lawyer or an adjuster to fight the insurance company to pay fairly what's owed. So.
Okay. The next bucket of questions, how do I know when my home is safe to return to? You addressed having the post test done, right, by the industrial hygienist. What about devices like Purple Air and Air Things, or anything else that you're aware of that could help us monitor the ongoing quality of the air with particulates and VOCs?
So I'm not familiar with those products, but I will say if you have to stay in your home and you're kind of close to this area, running an air scrubber or a HEPA filter to help, keep the air clean while you're sleeping or working in your home, putting maybe more than one in your house. Some of the, air scrubbers I showed, they're noisy or whatnot, but they filter a massive amount of air volume, and they can greatly reduce the amount of particulate that's, maybe floating around in the air inside your house. Because, keep in mind, every time you open the window, you're reintroducing everything that's outside inside. But if you keep everything closed up, the indoor air quality of your home can get to be a little sketchy, as well, because it's not breathing, it's not bringing in any new air. So investing in an air scrubber or a HEPA filter of some type is probably a good investment for a while.
We should get community scrubbers and just pass them around.
Right.
Um, okay, then going to the longer term recontamination, which you are just touching upon that, there's a lot of concern about the debris removal process, and would love to get your thoughts about, aside from, right, you're taking your shoes off before you're re-entering the home, what are other types of things that we can do to limit the reintroduction of contaminants into our homes?
Well, the Japanese have a great culture in this respect, in that they always, like to take off their shoes before they come into the house, and that's something that probably should be practiced to a certain degree, is, whenever possible, take your shoes off outside so that you don't track this stuff in. And then if you do have like a mud room, periodically wash, the bottoms of your shoes off to get all that stuff off before you walk throughout through the rest of the house. So you might have shoes that just stay for inside the house, and then shoes that are just for outside. And so, that's probably a good way to minimize some of that. The other way, again, is like a lot of people have talked about the amount of ash that's in their garages, that their garages are full of ash and soot because there's so many air gaps around the door where ash and soot gets in. So if you come in your home through your garage, the restoration companies are going to really need to do a job cleaning up those garages.
Okay. What about things, I've heard people discussing with insurance companies about replacing their windows. I've heard of several families who have had their home fully remediated, and then a week later, ash reappears on their windowsills, but the insurance companies don't want to replace windows. So thoughts on windows replacement, and then there's some kind of like plastic covering that you can put on it that has been suggested to keep ash out.
Yeah, so I mean, again, insurance companies aren't going to pay, typically for, repeated cleanings as well as window replacement, unless there's physical, visible damage to the window as a result of the fire. So if you have vinyl windows and the frame is bubbled because of the heat, or you're noticing between the panes of glass that there's like a fog developing where you can't see clearly through the glass because there's condensation, sometimes that's an indication that the window's been directly damaged by the fire. Sometimes the winds will kick up sand and dirt and literally sandblast the surface of the glass to where you can feel with your fingers how rough the glass is, because it's been just damaged by the pebbles and the sand from that force of wind. So you want to do a real close inspection and maybe have a window expert come out and write up a report on the condition of the windows to help support the need for replacement if it's warranted.
So I'll do a follow-up on that. There's been a lot of discussion about window companies, and some are coming out and just saying they all need to be replaced. And then others will come out and say, oh, it looks okay. So it kind of goes back to that. How do you trust, or how do you figure out who's telling the truth and not just trying to make money?
And you know what? This is a common thread through every facet of this process, whether it's the window guy or the carpet guy who says, oh, we can clean the carpet. Another guy says we can replace the carpet. Is the window guy really saying that because he wants a job of replacing all the windows, or is he being honest? This is very, very difficult. And this is where, if you're going to have a consultant, you want one to come out that doesn't own a window company or isn't somehow benefiting. You want an independent third party to come out and give you opinions on whatever it is that you feel may be damaged, that you need an expert's opinion. So it has to be an unbiased opinion. Otherwise, the insurance companies, they're going to bring in their own experts who are going to say the complete opposite. So unless it's legitimate. So.
And then the last bucket of questions, and then we can open it up, is what is the long-term effects of these toxins? You talked a little bit about that earlier. But a lot of questions on what is the risk. Basically, is it safe to stay is what it boils down to. Like, how long will we have to worry if our kids are digging in the ground, or when can they go outside barefoot? How concerned should we be about those longer term health effects?
Well, somebody called me, was it yesterday before, about the golf course where they're talking about closing. Was that you, Laura, that told me about the golf course?
But there is a golf course and there's a big fire burn scar near it.
Yeah, so somebody was saying that they're talking about not just closing the golf course. I think they were saying because they were concerned about health risk from all the ash that's all over the course. So I would be mindful of some of these local community issues like that as sort of a metric, like some of the nurseries or preschools. If they're not letting the kids play in the playground, it's a good indication that there might be some issues for small children playing in this, at the park or even in the yard until there's been some rain. Rain has a great way of cleansing the air as well as pushing some of the surface ash and debris down into the soil. So yeah, letting Mother Nature do her job as far as, having some different cycles of some weather systems come through will do a tremendous job in making the outdoor environment better as each day goes on.
So
but when they start doing, when they start doing debris removal and start tearing, down the damaged homes or digging up, all the debris and clearing the lots, there's going to be spikes in air quality where it's going to be worse on some days, even though they're going to be using guys with fire hoses to wet down and, and spray, the dust. There's still going to be exposures for a while. There's just no way around it.
And then another question related to that is we've heard a lot, the snow and the rain will wash things away. But then there was a specific question of when can I grow vegetables in my garden again? So there's concern about the contamination of the soil.
Yeah. Well, again, until you know what the composition is of the contaminants, you don't know. I mean, again, if it's the bulk of it is, more vegetation, trees, brush, that kind of stuff, it's going to be less of a concern than if it's, lead dust and, dioxins and some of this crazy stuff from burnt plastic. So until you know what you're dealing with, it's difficult to say. But other people have basically taken the top, inch or so of their soil out and imported new soil and, amended it and then had their gardens, within weeks. So.
Okay. That's the buckets of the broader categories. Do you want to open it up for questions, Sean?
Yeah, sure. How many people are left on?
We still have 86 people.
Oh, okay.
I ask you to limit it to one question per person. No.
Oh, no, well, I mean, I can do, we got here something from Lee, soil test company recommendations. So no, I'm in San Diego, so I don't know local companies in your area. So that one I can't answer on soil testing. And so for hygienists, okay, so you want them to test for VOCs, heavy metals.
Answering the questions, Sean, because we don't know which question you're answering. Can you?
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
I thought you were saying so. Jake is saying for a hygienist, what should they test for? And so I typically would have them test for the composition of soot, char, ash, meaning you want to look for heavy metals, dioxins, and other combustion byproducts. And Prism Analytical is a company that I've used, and they will tell you what they typically test for and what it costs for what you're looking for.
Can you roughly ballpark how much like that testing was for the children's clothing? Like, are you talking?
I think it was. See, so when I did the children's clothing testing, I went to Target and bought a brand new onesie as a control, because what I didn't know is if baby onesies come from China or Indonesia with these chemicals already in them. So I had that tested alongside with the contaminated onesie, and the brand new one was absolutely pristinely clean. I was blown away. I think it just had like, some fragrance that was in it, and that was it. But other than that, but yeah, so it costs probably $600 to $800 to get the testing and then a report. But again, that was a couple of years ago, so it may be more now. It's not cheap, but it's if you're really concerned, especially items that directly were saturated, it's worth it, I think.
And what about, there's a follow-up, is heavy metal dioxins content the same in everyone's homes from the fire, or is it different? So that kind of goes to your composition.
Yeah, well, I mean, you would think that it would all be the same, but it just depends on the proximity you are to a house that has more contaminants versus a house that may have very little contents that produces less contaminants. But overall, in my experience, houses are built pretty much with the same materials. So it's it should be pretty close that most homes would have the same composition of, char and ash as next door neighbors or even down the street. So, but, for you to get the insurance company, to do something for you, they're going to want a sample in your house. They're not going to rest that your neighbor got a test, 2 blocks away and theirs was off the chart, because how do they know that the chain of custody that neighbor didn't just go to their across the street and take a sample of the ash that was literally at a home that burned to the ground. So when a hygienist comes out, there's a sequence of a chain of custody where they say, okay, I went into the kitchen on the windowsill and took the sample on this date at this time, and Laura was present or whatever. So there's a very precise methodology for them to document the locations of the sampling and the dates and all that stuff. So
following up, I'm just reading through these about, can I wash my own clothes with regular laundry detergent to safely restore them?
Well, I would say, I mean, if they're affected by smoke and wildfire debris, I would say no. Okay. I mean, so dioxins is not water soluble. If you did have dioxin contamination, the only way to really destroy dioxins is to burn it at 100 or 1550 degrees. So yeah, that's why that paper I wrote on dioxins, you guys got to just read it. It's super easy. It's written at a third grade level, so that a layperson can understand it without all the technicalities that scientists did. So yeah,
I will include that in the follow-up. What about books, paper goods?
If it has surface, a lot of that stuff can be, HEPA vacuumed off and it'd be okay if it's just, sit on surface. But keep in mind, there are books today in the San Francisco library from the 2005 earthquake and fire that still smell like smoke today. That's what, 150, no, wait, was it 2020? So yeah, so it's like 120 years ago. So that just goes to show you that if you don't get the source of the smoke out, it could last a long time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does anyone want to try to ask a question live?
Okay, here's one. It says, what about replacing insulation in vaulted ceilings? So vaulted ceilings often is sort of insulated to where if there's not any vents outside that would allow the soot and the ash to get in, it might be okay. Because a lot of times the insulation is pushed up against those vents to where air doesn't even flow. However, if it does have a way in, then yeah, then it could be in the vaulted ceilings. But whether or not you will actually smell it through the vaulted ceiling would be another question. So,
what about chimneys? Would you recommend chimneys as a potential opening where smoke, soot, and ash could come in?
Yes. I mean, so when you have 110-mile-an-hour winds, it's conceivable that the spark arresters and the caps on your chimneys probably blew away. If that's the case, you can get like a backflow where the air will literally could go down into the chimney, backwards and deposit, soot and ash in your living room through the opening of the fireplace. So I would recommend for people to have your roofs inspected. That high of wind, it's possible that shingles can rip off, the little covers on your vents, for your plumbing pipes can blow away. You can have ember scars where the wildfire blows embers and those embers will stick to the roof and burn, or sometimes burn spots on your siding. Or, if they land on windowsills, they can burn scars on your windows. So look forensically like Sherlock Holmes around your house for any sign of wildfire debris causing these little burn scars.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have a question for the renters in the area. We have a lot of people struggling who are renters, and that the landlords are not doing remediation necessarily up to standard. So this is, if I don't have control over cleaning and replacing my carpet and insulation, et cetera, is leaving the area the safest option?
That's tough because, that's an enormously difficult financial decision to relocate, to uproot your family, to go to another location. So I really can't answer that question. If a landlord isn't doing what's necessary to be done, and you're convinced, or feel strongly that, your carpet couldn't be cleaned and they're just band-aiding it, then it may be worthwhile to get a hygienist on your own, have the carpet surface sampled, and have it sent in and prove that, hey, this carpet has got all sorts of nasty stuff in it. I want it replaced, or it's going to be, lawyer time. There's certain laws and regulations in every state that protect renters from slumlords, that are just literally don't care about the health and safety of their tenants. So I would look at those laws and see what your rights are.
I have a question that I've seen a lot, but it's not posted in here. Is it safe to stay in your home until it is remediated?
Well, I would say probably not, just because the chemicals that they're going to be using, if they're using hydroxyls or ozone, you can't really be in there when all that's going on. It's just in the machines that are running, you won't sleep. So I would say you should be out of your house while they're doing that work, typically, if you can. Now, there is a question here from Keith. He says, popcorn ceilings, ash got through a skylight and fell down into our kitchen. Should that popcorn ceiling be replaced, sealed, painted? So you're right. Popcorn ceilings are a challenge because they are very, very absorbent. So typically you either scrape and reshoot the ceiling, or you can seal and paint over it. When you paint the popcorn, it gives it a different look. But yes, it's a good point that popcorn ceilings typically have to be addressed if the ash came through the skylight, like you're saying. Yeah.
Betsy has a question about the outdoor hot tub. I know she's been trying to get an answer on that one. Is what would you recommend with an outdoor hot tub where ash actually was able to get in through the cover, even though it was closed?
Yeah, so I would change out the water, because if you look online, for instance, so when you get a lot of ash in the water, those toxins make the water itself have all sorts of chemicals that you don't know what you're going to be bathing in or soaking in. So I would venture to say, drain the hot tub, have it serviced and cleaned. And Betsy's got her hand raised.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up
Please.
to that?
Sure.
I've actually also been concerned because there are, air slits. I mean, they're, 1/4-inch air slits that go into all the electronics and the wiring. And it seems nuts that we're paying tens of thousands of dollars to clean the interior where a tiny bit of soot came in. Is there any concern that could corrode the operation of it? And I also had a second question about the insurance company or the cleaning company wants to non-salvage my antique, very beloved sofa. Is it possible to safely reupholster?
Yes. Yeah, I would say you can definitely safety reupholster something like that, because the frame is wood that can be easily cleaned and refinished if needed, and the reupholstery could be done, and they just replace the stuffing if there's heavy smoke. So yes, it can be done. It might be expensive, but for a keepsake like that, you could do it. Now, as far as your electronics, she was asking about electronics and other things. So yes, there's always a risk when you're sending out your electronics, especially if you guys out there with computers. So right now, back up everything that you have on your hard drives to an external hard drive, put it in the cloud, do whatever you need to do, because there is a risk that the smoke odor and the particulates can cause your computer to malfunction over time, because there is an acidic component elements to smoke, which definitely can affect the sensitive, motherboards and micro, chips within a computer. So if you don't want to lose your data, this would be a good time to back everything up.
I just wanted to call out, Chris was the one who asked about the renters situation, and someone posted a resource called Our Front Porch is a great resource for renters, also homeowners. So Our Front Porch, it's in the chat for if you're a renter and you have a question about that. I'm going to read this one. It says, our home has a little bit of soot and ash in the windowsills, but not all the way inside the home when tested with a chem sponge. The restoration company is saying that we need to move all of the items to clean. I see this a lot in the community. So the question of like, do I really need to do all this restoration when I don't see it further into the home? Your thoughts?
Well, in some cases, the restoration company is probably correct, depending on how much soot and ash really is in the house. In other situations, it could be just a way for them to, incur a whole bunch of billing. So, that's where you sort of have to kind of go in and walk alongside the technician from the restoration company and let them prove to you there's a need. If there really isn't, then you might take a different approach. But overall, if your house is relatively close to this impacted area, it's highly likely that you've got some level of soot, char, and ash in your home that's going to need to be cleaned for sure. So,
can I ask? That was my question. Oops, sorry.
No, go ahead. Finish up on your end.
My question was actually the restoration company wants to move all the big items out to clean the house. Is that absolutely necessary when they tested with a chem sponge, they didn't find any soot or ash inside the house, like besides near the windowsills?
Well, again, I'm not there, but I would say, and generally speaking, you wouldn't need to move your furnishings out if there's no real evidence of soot, char, or ash. That could be just a tactic to incur cost, tremendous cost to move and store your stuff in their facility. And so if you don't think that it's really warranted and necessary, then it probably isn't, needed.
Thank you. Lee, do you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. So we have a 9-month-old who's learning how to scoot and roll and puts his mouth on everything. And we have the same situation, just some visible ash on windowsills. And I barely saw it on the carpet. And I've just been back and forth on like, is the restoration company like over functioning here or under functioning? But it, the whole house smelled like an ashtray. And I am having some issues with my insurance company getting approval agreement on replacing our carpet and our couches that are textiles. And so I just don't know, like, I just can't tell what the risk is. And so I guess that hygienist came in, we had a hygienist company come in, and it just seemed like the quality of air was like the same as outside. I don't know how much to push on it. Like, am I being hyperbolic, or should I, like, my kid is learning how to walk and crawl and he's going to have his mouth on the couch and the carpet constantly. Mm-hmm. So should I really push to have the insurance company replace that for the sake of my developing lungs of the 9-month-old and 4-year-old too?
Absolutely. Okay. Yeah, I mean, okay, if it was me, yeah. I would fight for that. And in the hygienist, depending on who's hired him or her, if you've hired him or her, that report could be somewhat different than if the insurance company hired him or her.
We did hire them. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So the way they write that report, if they have concerns that there could be a potential health risk of exposure to your infant son, or toddler, then that's typically insurance companies don't really want to mess with that. For the cost of replacing the carpet is pennies compared to a potential war they would face if somebody got sick or you were able to prove that they were acting in bad faith, and it went into that arena of legal matters.
Yeah, and I think I wasn't informed enough when the industrial hygienist came in, because I felt like they just were taking air samples, but not specifically using that scrubber on the couch or the carpet, say. And for instance, they went into my wife's car and they were able to show us a report that the char was at a 5 out of 5. And we're 7 houses up from where the fire stopped.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know. It's fighting that different insurance for getting that car totaled, but it's just I was surprised. So I think I might need to redo the testing. Does that sound like what you might do?
Yeah, I mean, again, I lean on the side of caution. I'm looking at, the citrar ash thing in a far different light than most of my colleagues in the restoration industry, and even many hygienists who are not really see. Most hygienists are more versed well in the mold, indoor air quality, asbestos-led arena versus wildfire composition contaminants. This is a little bit new for a lot of them. So I'm kind of blazing a trail in this respect. So you kind of got to direct them a little bit based on what we've shared tonight and what you'll read on those papers on my website. That will help you explain and direct your hygienist to what you're looking for.
Thank you
Because
so
a lot of them are just looking for the presence of soot, char, ash to determine the level of cleaning. You don't care about that. You know it's there. You want to know the composition. What is in that soot, char, and ash?
Okay. So that sounds great. Thank you.
So Sean, I want to build on that because Janine is on, and Janine has also reached out to me, is an environmental consultant, and I think she just asked a question of how can I get insurance companies to understand that air and surface testing is important. That's a lot of questions in this community, is how do we help insurance companies? Their pre-loss condition is removal of ash, soot, smoke, and the smell of smoke. And our pre-loss condition definition is usually removal of all toxins. So have you seen any strategies?
Oh yeah. So this is really good. So if we can let Janine talk and put her up. And I know Steve has got a question. Let me get Steve first because he's had his hand up. And then I really want to address this with Janine. So Steve, what questions did you have?
Hi, this is Steve. Thanks for taking my question. What's going on with us is that we rely on the independent adjuster that is assigned by the insurance company, and he came in to manage every aspect of the testing and cleaning and restoration. We don't know what question to ask at that time, but it seems to me he's addressing a lot of the question that you talked about. My question is, it seems to me he's covering every basis, but are there anything we need to worry about or what we need to watch out for when we have this independent adjuster come in? Seems to be doing a job, but on the other hand, he's assigned by the insurance company, right? So what are the things we need to watch out for?
Okay, well, Steve, so if he's doing a good job and you're commenting, I mean, there's really, really good adjusters out there. Don't get me wrong, I'm not anti-insurance. I just, want people to be aware that there, like any industry, there's good guys and bad guys. So be aware of that. So if you feel like he's taking care of you, and after you've had a chance to read the information on some of the papers that I've published about the toxicity of smoke, etc., at the very end of all this, before you say goodbye to your adjuster, your insurance, just get a clearance test. That will be a piece of paper that will prove that all of this work that was done by your restoration company / independent adjuster was legit. Because if they take shortcuts, if they put camouflage in your home, like fancy fragrances or use ozone, all that stuff could just be deceiving your sense of smell, and at the end of the day your house may not even be nearly what it needs to be. So let an independent consultant, like a certified industrial hygienist or somebody like that, be the final say, so that you've got an unbiased party that's looking out for the health and welfare of you and your family.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk to Janine for a minute. And then I definitely saw here about this. So let's see here. Maureen also has a question about hydroxyl. So these are really good questions. So let me talk to Janine. Janine, can you get on?
I can. Hello.
Hey, how are you?
I am good. And I have to tell you, I am so glad to see something like this happening and you putting this information out there, because it is very unknown. and the dangers, and with there being no regulations and exposure limits and everything like that, so many people are vulnerable. I have Tyvek suits in my car that I give out to people when I see them in rubble. I mean, and masks and just the equipment, because I'm like, please put this stuff on, wear the gloves,
Yeah.
put the mask on, put the suits on. And this, I was so happy to see this. So
Yeah,
thank you.
thanks. Well, and so I know that a lot of the questions that a lot of these folks have tonight, in some cases can be better answered by you than me, because you're boots on the ground, you're in the local, situation there in Boulder, and you know kind of what's going on better than I do. So I wanted to share with you, your question was about how to compel the insurance companies to do what you're recommending. So part of it is the science doesn't lie. So, when your samples come up with, let's say you do find dioxins, and they're like, who cares? It's not a federally regulated substance. Then you lean on the OSHA permissible exposure limits and just say, oh, did you know that there is no permissible exposure limit for dioxins? That raises the alarm. And then any other host of items or substances that you find in your sampling, whether it's air or surface, you just basically go to the nth degree to explain the toxicity of that chemical or that VOC or that particle that you found, and what the health risk is of exposure. And when you start blowing up your report saying, oh my gosh, this is a known carcinogen, let's just say you find formaldehyde, you can just go on and write, a dissertation on one chemical. So when you bombard them with the facts of what's there, at some point they're going to be like, oh shit, oh sorry, we better do something here, because Janine has basically lifted the skirt. She's the wizard behind the curtain now, and she's exposed the fact that this is a really a bad situation. So we're just gonna pay this and make it go away. I got to tell you guys something. To give you an example, I had a lady call me the other day. This is a few months ago, actually. And she had her neighbor's car exploded in a condominium complex, and the smoke from the car went into her unit. And the insurance company called out, all the typical characters, the national franchises, to do the cleaning and the scrubbing and replace the carpet, but we're going to just paint the walls and do all, we call it the glorified Band-Aid treatment. But she still smelled smoke. She was very concerned about health. Anyway, she got my papers and she was reading them, and she started copying and pasting the data. And at the end of the day, the insurance company was so compelled, because of all of the science and the facts of the findings with her hygienist, they bought her condo. They basically said, we're not going to just pay you your policy limits, we're buying your condo. And they paid her to basically move away. So that being said, if you have enough strength in your documentation, you can go a long way when you can prove the science. So
can I ask you one more thing in regards to that?
Yeah.
So I have a lot of clients who, I recommend the air sampling, the randomized wipe sampling, things like that for pre and post remediation. Some who are just like every remediation company come in, I'm over a mile away from the fire, saying I have to do everything. When I am providing them with the levels, because it's not very cheap for sampling, that, in quick turnaround time and things like that, they have a tendency to go more towards presence absence because it's cheaper and insurance is not covering it. Is that something I should just take out in a situation like this? Because the presence absence is going to be there regardless. That's not going anywhere. We're going to find char present. We're going to find it present for a while to come, just because it's going to be in the air. People are going to track it in. Should I be leaning more towards just percentages and quantifiable numbers and the composition, instead of, even offering that?
Well, to be honest with you, I would write your reports as though you had to sit in a courtroom and justify your findings on every single individual basis. If you cut corners or sort of average or started, doing things in a different manner that you're normally customarily doing, then it's like you're changing your standard of care for your customer. So in this situation, that it's your experience, because you're certified in wildfire, that this is more toxic than maybe the public realizes. So you have to stand your ground, and just, it is what it is, so that's my 2 cents.
No, I appreciate that. Most people don't realize the toxicity of it, and so yeah. Thank you.
All right, so do we still have a lot of people on board, or are they dropping off?
They're dropping off, but we're still at 78.
All right, well, let's this is actually good, and I hope people are getting value from this talk.
I think they are, otherwise they would have dropped, because we're going on 2 hours, so it's got to keep their attention.
It's a marathon Zoom.
Exactly. You were going to touch upon the hydroxyl ozone. I know you have an article written about that, but can you quickly touch on that?
So Marla is talking about hydroxyl. So hydroxyls is a gas. It's similar to ozone. The problem is that the hydroxyl generators also produce ozone. So you're not just getting pure hydroxyl gas, unless you're using, I believe, Odorox is a manufacturer of a hydroxyl generator that may just produce hydroxyls. The other ones that I've actually tested some of them myself, and they do produce, they call themselves hydroxyl, but they're just ozone generators. And if you're using ozone, I mean, it does neutralize a certain spectrum of contaminants. But the other thing is, if you go into a room where an ozone generator is operating, it literally will deaden your sense of smell. You'll have an odor like mountaintop fresh air. It's like almost euphoric. It's weird, but it literally neutralizes your olfactory nerves in your nose to where you can't smell anything. So that's another byproduct of ozone, that it does definitely affect your your nasal, your nose and your sense of smell. So okay, so anyway, but again, I talk a lot about that in my articles.
Definitely. I will circulate that link to that page that we looked at earlier. Oh my goodness, I'm trying to keep up here. I will do a plug for the safety piece of it. Insider knowledge. I know someone who runs an outdoor daycare in Louisville, or preschool, I should say. And the Boulder Health Department would not let her reopen her preschool, our outdoor preschool, because it was not safe for the children. And nothing like that has been communicated to the community. And that's just really a huge red flag for me.
That's what I'm saying. So that's the kind of thing that people need to understand, that there's officials out there, quietly explaining that scenario in certain thing for kids. So, go run with that.
Yeah.
There's just a question here about, okay, what if, Marla says, what if they do the ozone while you aren't in the house? So, it takes, ozone also will, depending on the knowledge base of the person using it, it can destroy certain fabrics like rubber. It will completely decompose rubber. It does create, like I said earlier, as a byproduct of mixture with humidity or moisture, hydrogen peroxide, which is a bleach. And if it's in high concentrations, that type of corrosive chemical can affect microchips and delicate electronic components. So you got to be careful. And then there is obviously you don't know when you go into the home after the ozone machines have been turned off, what concentrations is still left in the house and for how long, and the byproducts. So I'm not a huge fan of ozone being used in people's homes. It's just, I know that there's a lot of risks. And so I would suggest check out my paper that I wrote on the website about ozone. Is it a friend or a foe?
There was a question earlier, and we touched upon this, but is there generally a distance from the fire associated with smoke damage? And how do you take into consideration the wind and like where the smoke plume went?
Well, it's hard to say because winds shift so often in a wildfire. It creates sometimes its own weather system. So although the predominant direction may have been one way, that's not to say that it doesn't get a swirling effect, and it could literally, act in a very peculiar manner depending on as the weather changed and the wind came from the other direction, and kind of the fire put itself out, sort of, right? Because the wind changed and dropped. Yeah, so it's hard to say distance because how long does it take for, a ember to travel at 110 miles an hour? If you're only 2 miles away, it's just seconds, right? Yeah, it's without actually seeing each house on a one-on-one basis, it's so hard to say whether or not your house is super, adversely affected or not. The further away you are in general, the better you are, as a rule of thumb. But again, it's hard to answer that one.
Thank you. If anyone has a question, I will, Ulana, I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name
Oh
correctly.
yeah, I know Ilana. She was on the emails today.
Do you want to ask a question? I see a little hand up.
Yeah.
Hi, sure. Yeah, I was asking about the post. Well, I wanted to comment about the post clearance testing. Sorry, my kid just came in and my dog started barking. Sorry. Basically, what was really helpful for us was to be able to take some of the information that Sean provided in that red guide and send it to our desk adjuster. And based on some of that information, we were able to, get our carpet replaced after they tried to clean it twice unsuccessfully. So it was really useful, as Sean was saying, right? The information is power. And when you're able to stick with it, and if you're, have the wherewithal to just keep on bombarding them with additional facts, that is actually a really powerful thing. One thing, though, I did have a question, Sean, was when we did get our post test clearance, it was really about the spore sample and the composition of the materials. So it was the percentage of ash, the percentage of dust, percentage of hair follicles, that kind of thing. It didn't actually tell us what the ash was composed of. Is there an additional test that we can do? And again, I took my own piece of tape and I put it in a Ziploc bag to take eventually, but should we have expected that the industrial hygienist would have done that as well?
No, they typically don't test for the composition of the ash. You have to ask specifically for that.
Okay, so if I have it in my, my little piece of tape in my Ziploc bag, I can ask them to do that still?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. And is that something you'd recommend also? I mean, yeah.
For me, again, for a clearance test, the clearance should state, the absence of the combustion byproducts. And if they do find some, they should tell you what it is,
right,
so that you can address it properly. Just, assuming that, that the ash is just this, mundane sort of like innocuous, like burnt marshmallow or something is absurd. You had 1,100 houses burned or something like that. So it's crazy. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to take my little Ziploc baggie of stuff and ask them to test it. Okay. Got it.
Ilana, if you wouldn't, are you part of the Facebook smoke damage remediation group?
I'm not sure. There are so many different groups right now, but if I'm not, I'm going to take a look and try to find
it. And that you can also message me and I can get it to you. But if you wouldn't mind sharing what you utilize to get the insurance to replace your carpet, I think that would be really helpful for the community.
Oh, great. Yeah. And it was definitely Sean's stuff.
Oh, I'm sure there's a lot.
And I will say that what Ilana's just shared with you guys, is there still people on? A bunch of people? Okay. So what she just explained is when you show your adjuster the science and your concerns and make it all about health and safety, and you're not caring about gaming the system or putting money in your pocket, that you're just truly, sincerely concerned, and you have this data to back you up, you're going to find that you're going to get a lot further in this process by showing them these types of facts, and as well as any results from the testing. than being aggressive and angry, on the phone and your emails. Just stay the course, be persistent, and the squeaky wheel gets the oil. I mean, that's kind of just the way it works. So now David and Jocelyn have questions.
Really quickly, just building on that before we go to one of them, is there's a question that links to that about the school districts and how do you get them to kind of pay a little bit more attention using data. And I think this builds upon, they did remove the mulch, but it took some fighting for them to remove the mulch. They did the air remediation on inside, but they're not doing the grass and other surface areas. And the comment from Jill is that it's strange that they told a daycare that they couldn't have children outside. So I just want to clarify that part. This preschool was 100% outdoors. And so because it was 100% outdoors is why the Boulder Public Health Department said they couldn't operate in Louisville. For other preschool programs, because I have a kid who's in preschool, they are allowed to go outside, but they have been directed to not play in the sandbox, for example. And the teachers have been directed to look for respiratory issues while the children are outside. And if there are, to bring the children inside. So there's a slight nuance there. But again, I still think the information should be out there more publicly so people can make a decision as to what is or isn't safe. But do you have any data that we could share with the school districts to kind of help them look beyond particulate matter?
Well, again, those papers that are on my site have so much information about toxic smoke particulates, the dioxins. I mean, all these things are all components of the wildfire aftermath. And so the fact that they're telling the preschool that it's not safe, what are they basing that on? Are they basing it on something that I've just been talking about for 2 hours, or is it something else? So they know something that they are very concerned about the small children being exposed to, and what's behind that? I mean, if it's not safe for them, then is it safe for 6 and 7 year olds or 10-year-olds or 40-year-olds? I mean, what are we dealing with? So that's where you kind of start to dig and see, like, really what do they know? Did somebody at the city or county level do some ash testing and they found something that was really concerning? So I don't know. These are questions to ask.
I wish I had answers. All right. Do you want to go with Jocelyn or David?
I think Jocelyn was next.
Great.
Hi there. So I'm a renter, and my townhouse that I lived in did set fire. My garage set fire, but they were able, the firemen were already in the neighborhood, and so they were able to stop the fire in my garage. But it did do major smoke damage to the whole home. There is that thin layer of ash that you described when you move an object on the counter. There are rings everywhere in every level of the 3-story townhouse, in every bathroom, everywhere. Our renter's insurance used words like everything can be cleaned, and that there was not a fire in my dwelling, even though there are smoke, like ash, up every vent around the townhouse. He is saying that there is no fire in my dwelling. So I am trying to figure out the best utilization of resources and information, considering I don't have a lot of money to be able to spend on like a $2,000 hygienist to come in and prove that there was a fire in my dwelling. So I'm just curious what resources or facts, either from your website or elsewhere, I could utilize to help file my claim.
Yeah, so in your situation, if you're fighting against a limited budget to fight the landlord and the insurance companies. So your best bet is to, you kind of have to take that leap to have a hygienist prove that you've got a serious contamination issue. And that with that ammunition, then you can go to that next level and say that you either need to be relocated to another unit in the complex, or somewhere else while they do the proper work, or get an attorney involved to to go to bat for you. But
Just to
fighting
clarify,
it on your own.
the dwelling is unlivable. So I'm no longer living there, and I'm not having any issues on the landlord side. This is purely renter's insurance to do with the contents.
Yeah, so I would say with the contents, having a lab do a surface sample of, like, say, one of your sweaters or something that was exposed. Have it sent to them, and they will basically tell you that, what kind of contaminants are in it. It's all in the data. If you just say, oh, I smell something, and then the adjuster says, well, I don't smell anything, and who's to say that smelling a little bit of smoke is that big of a deal? Now you're fighting a different battle where it's all about, there's no science involved. You got to have, specific data and facts to back up your claim and your concerns, with underscored with the safety issue, health and safety, as that sort of that foundation.
What would you say is the most affordable approach to do that?
For me, I would say the most affordable approach would probably be to, if you hire a public adjuster, they're going to take a percentage of your renter's insurance proceeds. Sometimes that can be, 20, 25%, depending on how much limits you have. Or you can go it on your own and have a hygienist that you hire, provide data that shows that it's truly contaminated. And the hope is that you'll get that money reimbursed to you as a claim expense, because you had to incur that cost to prove that there was a problem.
Okay, so that should hopefully be reimbursed.
Well, that's something I would ask a public adjuster, if there's something that they can do to help you in that situation.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, David, it's been waiting a long time.
Hi, so our house was right next to the fire. All the houses to the west of us burned down completely, so that those 100-mile-per-hour winds were blowing ash directly into our house. There was enough heat to blister the paint on 2 walls. So how concerned should I be about the wall insulation? And can an industrial hygienist test inside the wall cavities?
Yes, so they can take samples. Some of them will use what they call a boroscope. It's just basically a camera on a wand, and they'll drill a small hole, and they can basically look in to see if there's burn damage, or they'll just open a section of drywall and take out some of the insulation and look in there. So with literally blistering on the wall, that's a whole different ball game, because now you've got a lot of heat that could affect wiring in the wall. Plumbing could be affected. You've got the flashing issues of there's a vapor barrier behind your siding or your stucco that could be compromised. So yeah, you have a little bit more concerns with that level of heat.
So Allstate just wants to scrape and paint. So how do I convince them that we need to open up the walls? And
well, you may not be able to convince them to pay to open the wall. You may just need to open the wall and find it, to see for yourself. And, just, do it carefully. And if it's just a minimal patch and you find there's nothing, then you're in good shape. But if it's worse than you think, because, you're dealing with a concealed space, they don't pay money for assumed assumed damages or concealed damage. They need to see the damage. There needs to be evidence of damage. So you may have to just, explore it on your own and see if there is, something going on inside the walls.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
All right. I think we should call it a wrap. 2.5 hours.
Okay, sounds good. Well, I hope you guys, found some of this information useful. Again, my website's packed with all sorts of, good stuff for you guys. So feel free to share it, use it. And I hope, you guys in Boulder recover quickly and everybody stays safe and healthy.
Thank you, Sean, for your time and your generosity, truly, in helping our community.
For sure.
Really appreciate it.
All right. Well, more to come.
Thank you,
I'm sure we'll chat again at some point.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, everybody. Have a good night.
Have a good night, everyone. Good luck to everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Laura.
No problem. Kimber, can you stop the recording, please?
Thanks, Laura.
You're welcome.
Do you have a few minutes to stay on? Do you want to chat, or should we
I want to
circle
chat
back another day?
This is the kids' room and we're being recorded right now, but the kids need to go to bed. I need to get out of their room.
Thanks, Laura.
We'll talk soon. Bye, everyone.
We'll talk soon.
Have
Bye.
a good night. Bye.